is the end of a month, or I guess the start of a month. So that, of course, means it is time for a quick, maybe not so quick, March reading wrap up and April TBR. I did read quite a few books this month, so I'm gonna try and keep it as concise as possible, but this video might get a little long because I finished 12 books this month, which is quite a lot for me. But yeah, let's get right into it. First, starting off with all of my pretty high-level statistics. Again, if you're interested in more in-depth statistics, I do post more in-depth statistics in my reading journal videos, and that will be out next for March. So keep an eye out if you're interested in more in-depth stats. But for high-level stats, like I said, I finished 12 books in the month of March. 3 of them were physical, 4 of them were digital, and 3 of them were audio, and then 2 of them I read in multiple formats. One of them was a tandem or immersion read, and then one of them I switched formats about halfway through. As far as my average time to read, technically Storygraph says this is 50 days, but the reason that is 50 days is because one of the books I kind of soft DNF'd and wasn't actively reading for quite a while, but Storygraph didn't have the soft DNF feature until like the end of last year, which I did mark it as such when that happened, but it still kept all of my previous like currently reading status. And that contributed to that. If we only take into the account the time that I was actively reading that, my actual average time to finish was 9.33 days. And then my average star rating for the month was 4.42, which is pretty high. I had quite a lot of 4.5 and 5-star reads this month. Only one of my reads I rated below 4 stars, but all of my reads were above 3 stars this month, with the majority being 4 stars or above. So I had quite a good reading month this month, both in terms of quantity and quality. So that's the overall stats. Let's get into the actual books that I read. The first book I ended up finishing in March was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This was my second Tia Williams book. I read A Love Song for Ricky Wilde in February and really enjoyed that, and immediately went and put 7 Days in June on hold in Libby so that I could read that one as well. And this follows 2 authors who don't really interact in the publishing world, but have a history that no one knows about and have secretly been writing about each other for the entirety of their careers. And then they happen to end up on the same panel and have a bit of a back and forth on the panel that makes it very clear to pretty much the entire world that they know each other, and speculations start flying, and these authors reconnect. They haven't seen each other in a very long time, and we follow them through their reconnection and falling in love again, while also flashing back to the way that they know each other, which is that they spent 7 days in June together when they were teenagers, and we keep flashing back to those 7 days to see how they originally started loving each other and how that all fell apart and why they've been estranged for so long. And I really enjoyed this. I will say, please definitely check your trigger warnings before reading this one. I've put as many of them as I can think of on the screen, but be diligent about checking your trigger warnings if any of these are related in any way to anything that would trigger you, because this does deal with some very heavy topics and some pretty explicit depictions of a lot of stuff. So keep yourself safe before going into this one, but I really loved it. I think in both books, Tia Williams has a really beautiful way of kind of dealing with these heavier topics while also exploring them through romance, which I think is really incredible and I really love. And I also liked the relationship in this one as well. The relationship in the last one was like more magical and soulmatey, and this one is more kind of like real life, down to earth, if that makes sense. I will say I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars as well, just because I think The ending, if you've heard anyone talk about this book, I'm sure they've talked about the ending of this book. But the ending of this book, I thought was a little strange. And in my opinion, it made the book a little bit weaker, just the way that the ending plays out. I didn't love that. And I thought it was pretty unnecessary to kind of like string us along for that. But that's just my personal opinion. I know some people thought it was really great. It was just not my cup of tea. And then the other thing that I didn't love is, again, trying to keep it pretty spoiler free, the main conflict that like pulled them apart in their youth is a pretty contentious point throughout the book. You're kind of always waiting to see what happened and what pulled them apart. And there is like an underlying conflict that is addressed or introduced pretty early on in the book. And it plays into that larger conflict that pulled them apart. And I didn't feel like we ever dealt with what caused that conflict. Again, I'm trying to be kind of vague to avoid spoilers, but I just really didn't like that we never confronted the person that caused that conflict. And I felt like kind of let down by that because we felt like we were building up to having some kind of confrontation or discussion about the ways that this person acted. And we never really had any altercation or confrontation with them. And I thought that the book would have been stronger if we'd had that confrontation or acknowledgement of what this person did, instead of kind of just being like, oh, this person did something that I don't love or don't agree with. And we're just kind of like brushing it under the rug and forgetting about it, because that's just how they are. So I didn't love that like minute part of the conflict. And then also the ending was just a little strange to me, but that didn't take away too much from my experience. So that's why I still gave it 4.5 stars, because I think the rest of the book is really, really strong and holds up really well. And the themes are really interesting and the romance is really sweet. And I love that we get to see some chronic pain representation in this, and also some experiencing love as a single mother kind of stuff going on in here as well. And overall, just really generally enjoyed it. I will definitely be checking out anything that Tia Williams releases, since I enjoyed both of the books that I've read by her so far. The next book that I end up finishing in March was Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I technically have been reading this for most of February, and I actually had started it prior to February. This is the one that messed up my average reading time, because I'd originally, like a couple of years ago, started reading it on Libby for digital through the library. And I pretty quickly knew within like the first couple of chapters, I was like, oh, I'm going to actually want a physical copy of this to like annotate and highlight and reference back to and like flip back and forth through the book while I'm reading this. So I returned it to the library and like kind of DNF'd it then until I got a physical copy. And then like a year-ish later, I got a physical copy from an indie bookstore and pretty immediately read a few chapters in it then, but I'd kind of like not been super actively reading it for a while, just because it's pretty heavy and it's also very, very dense. It kind of reads like an academic thesis. And so it was really dense, and I was just like having a hard time getting into the beginning of it, even though it was really interesting and I was enjoying it. It was just like really dense and hard for me to get into. And so I put it down for a while and would kind of pick it up sporadically here and there, but I wasn't really actively reading it. And then at the beginning of February, I was like, okay, I need to buckle down and actually read this book and get through it. So I ended up in most of February, and then the first couple of days of March, I read like a chapter a day from this, which I think was a really good way to read it. Because it helped cut down on how like dense it was if I was just reading one chapter a day instead of sitting down for a long period and reading multiple chapters. So I think that was definitely the way that I needed to read it, but I did end up finishing it this month after a long spell of getting into and reading this book. And this book is, like I said, it's nonfiction, and it does read very much like an academic thesis. So it's pretty research heavy and can get pretty repetitive at times. But overall, I really enjoyed it and thought it was very impactful, and it discusses very important topics, obviously. It is about the unacknowledged caste system that exists in America that is based on race, and kind of compares that to the very popular and widely known caste system in India that is still very much followed, even though it isn't technically legal anymore. And then also the caste system that arose in Germany at a certain point in time. It compares all three of those and kind of discusses the ways that they mirror and contrast each other, and how the reasons why the caste system in America is so successful and kind of the ways that we can break out of it. So like I said, the topics are really, really important, and I feel like I learned a lot from this book. I feel like I think about this book like once a day. I'll see something in the news or read something online, and I just immediately like think back to how that relates to the unacknowledged caste system that we have in America. And so I think it had a big personal impact on me. But again, it did get a little repetitive at points, and it is very dense because it is kind of academic-y. There's a lot of points where the author is making the same point throughout the whole book, but is kind of outlining different examples of how America falls into this caste system by comparing them to different caste systems. So there's a lot of chapters that are kind of like repetitive in a sense, where they'll have the same big picture, but then are discussing different minute details. So I think it could have been toned down a little bit in how repetitive it is. But overall, I think it's a really, really important book, and I'm really, really glad that I read it. And I think it fits very nicely into my nonfiction books that I've read. I think it's important to understand the social systems that we're participating in, whether we acknowledge them or not, in just like living our day-to-day lives, but also in dismantling these systems that are harming everyone involved. So I'm glad that I read this so that I know more about that system and can learn more and dismantle it in the future. So definitely recommend this. But again, just be prepared for a little bit of a dense and repetitive read with this one, and I gave this 4.5 stars as well. Next up, I read Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is my first Octavia Butler book that I've read, and this follows Dana, who is a Black woman in the 1970s, and she has just moved into a new house with her husband when she unexpectedly and unexplainedly time travels back to kind of like the beginnings of her family tree that is written down that she knows about, and saves this little white boy from drowning. And she later finds out that he is her ancestor, and she's kind of called back in time every time that he's in a dangerous situation, and she kind of has to save his life because she knows, living in the future, that she's his descendant and that she can't let him die. But it deals a lot with kind of, she has to live back in this time. You know, she's a Black woman when slavery is legal, and her ancestor owns a plantation and has slaves. And so she kind of has to grapple with the reality of living in this time period for an unknown amount of time. She never knows when she's going to go back there or when she's going to return to her own time. And so it's just a lot of her trying to like come to terms with, while also fight back against the system that she's forced to live in that doesn't exist in the modern day that she's used to. And so really tough topics, but really, really well explored. And I think very necessary. I've never read a book that explores these particular themes in quite the same way. It talks a lot about, you know, having to become complacent in certain things in order to survive, and kind of weighs the moral dilemma of that a little bit. And so, again, I think the themes are really, really important. That being said, I ended up giving this 4 stars just because I didn't love the writing style. I think it's partially just like the time that this was written in. Like I said, I think this was published in the 1970s. And so, you know, writing style was just a little bit different back then. And it's not always my favorite in general. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is I'm just like not a super big historical fiction girl. I'm good with historical romance and historical fantasy, but just like straight up historical fiction is not my favorite genre. And this is pretty solidly historical fiction. I thought that this was going to have a bit more sci-fi, since this is like has the sci-fi element of the time travel, but that's not really a heavily used device. It's pretty like magical realism kind of level where it's never explained and is just kind of used as a plot device. So I wouldn't say that this book is really truly sci-fi. It is really more historical fiction, which again isn't my personal favorite genre. But I am really glad that I read it, and I think it was a very good book. And again, I've never read a book that explores these specific themes in this same way and to this same depth. So I think it's a very important read, and it was very impactful to me. But it just like wasn't my favorite stylistically, if that makes sense. But I did end up giving it 4 stars, and I definitely will be continuing my Octavia Butler journey and reading more of her books in the future. Oh, and this is also the one that I switched format in the middle. I was about 30 or 40% of the way into it. I was originally reading it digitally, and then I switched to audio, and I did enjoy the audio experience a lot more for this one. Just again, because I didn't really love the writing style itself, but I did really enjoy the narrator that I listened to for this one. So that's the last thing I have to say about that one. Right, then the next book that I finished was Eat the Ones That You Love by Sarah Maria Griffin. And I read this as an e-arc. This isn't actually out until April 25th. I got this through NetGalley. And I read the synopsis for this. First of all, the cover is really beautiful. I love the cover for this. But second of all, I read the synopsis for this and immediately it was like, I must request this because it is 2 things that I am particularly interested in. First of all, it's horror. I do love horror. I hadn't read any yet this month so far. So I was like, I need a horror book to give me that little horror bit this month. And then also, I was a theater kid in high school. And if you know anything about theater at all, I'm sure that you know what Little Shop of Horrors is. And I read the synopsis for this and me, it was like, this sounds like Sapphic Little Shop of Horrors, a book. And yes, it is that. For anyone who isn't familiar, Little Shop of Horrors is like a sentient plant experience. The plant eats people. And this is pretty similar on that concept, but this book is much more like literary horror and isn't really a comedy. Little Shop of Horrors is a bit of a comedy as well. But this isn't really comedic in any way. But this book follows our main character, Shell. She's just gotten out of a super long-term relationship. She broke up with her boyfriend of 7 years because they just were like kind of in a rut and they weren't really connecting anymore. And then their group of friends that they had together, Shell feels like kind of distance from them and feels like they're not really her friends anymore because they were kind of both of their friends. And a lot of her girlfriends from college are married to his guy friends from college. And so she feels like she's kind of lost her place in her friend group as well. And then she also loses her job. And so she has to move back in with her parents in her hometown in the house that she grew up in. And she's kind of just feeling like untethered from the entire adult life that she's had so far. And she's walking home from the grocery store at the kind of like epicenter of their little suburban town. The epicenter is this like kind of dilapidated, crumbling mall. That's where the center of their town is. That's where their library is. All of their like hairdressers are there. All of their shops are there. Their grocery store is there. So that's kind of like where everything is, but it is also like falling apart and the city wants to close it. So there's a lot of discussions of that stuff, but she's walking home from there and she sees a help wanted sign in a florist shop and goes in to check it out and becomes immediately infatuated with the shop owner, and things progress from there. The shop owner has a secret sentient plant in the greenhouse in the mall, and no one knows about it except for her. And this plant wants to use Shell to accomplish something that he really wants. So it just goes from there, follows Shell as she becomes increasingly infatuated with the shop owner and follows this plant's desires for Shell and the shop owner. This deals a lot with themes of like obsession and infatuation in a really interesting way and on a lot of different levels, which I really, really love when horror books explore that. It's one of my favorite like subcategories of horror, is dealing with kind of maybe dangerous obsession levels. I think it's something that's really interesting to explore, and that is kind of the main theme of this book. I do think it was a little bit long and it didn't go into as much horror stuff as I wanted. There is only really like one big horror scene, and it's quite towards the end of the book. So I felt like there wasn't enough build up to the horror as I wanted. But overall, I really, really enjoyed this book, and I'm excited to see what this author does in the future, because I think this was a really solid foundation, and I ended up giving this 4 stars. Next up, we have Don't Let the Forest In by C.G. Drews, and this is another book that deals a lot with obsession and dangerous levels of obsession and adoration with someone, and kind of like tragic fairy tale stuff. This is also a horror book. This one is YA. It follows our main character. He comes back to school after being away from the summer. He goes to a boarding school, and his best friend's parents are missing, and no one knows what happened to them. And he's kind of like, dude, did you kill your parents? His parents were kind of abusive towards him. So he's like, I won't blame you, I promise, but like, did you kill them? And his best friend insists that he didn't. And we pretty quickly find out that there are actually these monsters that are coming to life. Our main character is an author, a horror author, and his best friend is a horror artist. He draws a lot of like horror stuff. And so the horror creatures from all of his art that he draws of his friends' stories are all coming to life, and he's been fighting them at night secretly in the forest surrounding the boarding school. And so they kind of team up together, and it explores the relationship between them. They're in love with each other and are having a lot of difficulty in navigating that relationship because they're friends. And the main character is a twin, and his twin sister and his best friend, the 3 of them used to be a group, but his sister is like not talking to either of them at the beginning of the school year. And our main character doesn't really know why Dove is fighting with his friend and why they've kind of had this falling out. He feels like he doesn't understand why they're all falling apart, but things just escalate from there. And this was such a beautiful book. I loved the writing style so much. The horror elements are really, really well done. I like that they're kind of like beautiful and grotesque at the same time. That's one of my favorite things in horror, is when things are simultaneously beautiful and grotesque, and pretty much all of the creatures in this and the story itself are that. It has a very like unsettling feeling the entire time, and I just really, really enjoyed it. C.G. Drews has another book coming out this year that I'm really excited about as well. I might try and get the arc for that because I loved this one so much. But this book was just like so perfectly done, and I loved every second of it. And I was like so devastated by the ending, but also how could it have ended any other way? So yeah, really loved this, and I gave it 5 stars. Alrighty, out of the horror area of my month for a little bit, the next book I read was Here We Go Again by Alison Cochrun. This is the last book that I had not read by this author. I've read both of her other books, The Charm Offensive and Kiss Her Once for Me, and I really, really enjoyed both of those, and I enjoyed this one as well. This follows 2 women who were previously best friends, and then they had some kind of falling out and pretty much didn't talk to each other and hated each other for all of high school. And then one of our characters moved away for college, and then she comes back, and now they both teach at the same high school that they went to, and both of their favorite high school English teacher is sick. He has cancer and he's dying, and his dying wish is for both of them to take him on a road trip across the country. And so it just follows them kind of dealing with the falling out that they had and resolving all of these misunderstandings that they had, and also helping their high school English teacher fulfill his dying wish and reunite with the love of his life that he lost a really long time ago. He kind of left him. And so they're helping him find him again and reconnect with him. And it was just really, really beautiful. I think that the romance in this was really well done, but there's also the side romance of the English teacher finding his partner that he'd left a long time ago, that he always like kind of regretted the way that that ended. And I really enjoyed that as well. And this deals with a lot of themes of kind of like appreciation for the queer community that kind of set the foundation of the queer community that we have today and fought for a lot of the rights that we have right now. And kind of just the appreciation of that. And also, I really loved the romance between these two. Both of them have disabilities of different types, and both of them experience love and romantic attraction in different ways. And I really loved the relationship that they fostered and the way that they grew together. The ending is really devastating and really beautiful. I'm sure you can imagine what happens at the end based on what I've said so far. But yeah, I just think it was such a beautiful story, and all of the themes that were woven into this were really, really beautiful as well. And I think this is my favorite of her works. I have enjoyed all three of them a lot, but I think this one is my favorite, and I'm generally just going to read anything that she comes out with because I've enjoyed all three so far. But I gave this one 5 stars. All right, we're halfway done. The next book that I ended up reading in March was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is a fantasy fairy tale, dark fairy tale kind of book. It has a pretty fairy tale setup. Our main character has to gather all of these things and meet all of these people, and she is trying to save her older sister from her abusive husband, who is the king of a very powerful nation. And so she's kind of trying to find all of these people to help her and gather all of these different items, and then they travel up to the kingdom to try and get rid of this king so that her older sister can be free. That's a pretty basic setup. This is beautifully like in the dark fairy tale realm. I really, really loved all of the like darker elements in this book that kind of contributed to that fairy tale feeling. It very much feels like, original fairy tale kind of things where there is love and moments of happiness and like found family aspects and all of that, but there also is a lot of like horror adjacent or straight up horror stuff in here, which I really love. If you can tell based on my review of other books that I've had in this video. But yeah, I really enjoyed those aspects. And then I also thought that the characters were really interesting because they're all kind of character archetypes in a way. They all fall within, typical fairy tale kind of character types, but they also all pretty strongly oppose their character archetypes. For example, we have like a knight in shining armor kind of a character, but he also is like not a knight in shining armor. He pretty often and frequently opposes that what you would expect of that character archetype. We have, a fairy godmother who does some very unfairy godmother like things and kind of switches up that script a bit. So I think that the way that the characters were done was really, really interesting, and I really, really loved that as well. I will say this book was a bit slow at times, and I think that the way that the flashbacks were done at the beginning was a little strange. Just kind of like the pacing and setup of the beginning was a little weird. And again, just like the pacing overall was a little wonky to me. But overall, I enjoyed this. This is my second T. Kingfisher book. The first one I read was What Moves the Dead, and I liked this vastly more than that. I did not love What Moves the Dead. I thought it was fine, but it really wasn't my favorite thing, but I did really enjoy this, and I will definitely check out more of T. Kingfisher's works in the future. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. All right, then we're getting into all of the books that I read for the Trans Rights Readathon, which went from March 21st to March 31st, leading up to the Trans Day of Visibility. I participated in this last year as well, but this year I had quite a longer TBR. I had 5 books on my TBR, and I ended up reading 5 books, although one of them was swapped from my TBR. But this was also extended a few days. It's previously been a week, so 7 days, and this year it was 11 days to give it a little bit of extra time. So yeah, let's get into the books that I read for that, which is the rest of the books that I read this month. The first book that I read during the Trans Rights Readathon was The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. I started reading this before the Trans Rights Readathon, and I didn't know that it had a trans character going into it, but it does, and I finished it after the readathon, so I still counted it in my number of books that I read during the readathon for my donations and stuff. And also this was the one that I swapped out. I read this one, but I didn't read another book on my physical TBR just because I didn't have enough time. But this follows our main character, Amina al-Sirafi. She was a pirate in her heyday. She was a very successful pirate, and there was a job that her crew had that kind of went south. And so she left that life and has since had a daughter and has kind of just full-time become a mother and left the pirating life behind. But one day, the mother of one of her crewmates that died in that kind of final job comes to her and says, "Hey, I need your help. My granddaughter was kidnapped. I think you're the only one that can find her. Let's snap to it. Go do that, or else I'm going to tell everyone who you are, and the authorities will come looking for you and your family." So she agrees to help out, gathers kind of her old crew back together, and goes in search of this woman's grandchild. So that's the basic setup for that. And I really, really loved this. I love Shannon Chakraborty. The Devabad trilogy is one of my favorite series of all time. I'm making my husband read it right now. I'm also trying to get my mom to read it. So it's just a book series that I love. I love her writing style. I love the characters that she creates. She creates such real characters. That's my probably favorite thing about her writing. Her characters are so human. None of her characters are good and none of her characters are bad. They're all varying degrees of gray. And I really, really love that about her. All of her characters are selfish and selfless, and that is very much true in this book as well. And I love the found family aspect of this as well. And I also really, really love that Amina al-Sirafi is an older female protagonist. She has had a child. She's older. She's not in what some would consider her prime anymore. And she feels the aches of her aging body while she is going on this adventure and trying to save this person. And I love this. This is technically in the same world as the Devabad trilogy. It takes place many, 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 many hundreds of years before the plot of that book and series. And you don't technically have to read that one before this, but I would recommend it because there are little nods to the Devabad trilogy that we get in this book, and I think it will enrich your experience if you've read the other one first, but it is not necessary if that one doesn't interest you, but this one does. So yeah, I'm really excited. I loved this, and I'm so excited for the rest of the series. We just got a book 2 announcement of when that's coming out. So that's really, really, really exciting. And I'm so excited to see where else this series takes us. And I very highly recommend. This is also the one that I tandem / immersion read, which means I just read the physical book while listening to the audiobook, and I very highly recommend. The audiobook for this is incredibly well done and so funny and added so much to the story of this. So very highly recommend the audiobook if you're planning on reading this. And I give this 5 stars, obviously, because I've been sitting here raving about it for however long this section ends up being. But yeah, just really incredible work from Shannon Chakraborty. Yet again, one of my faves of all time. She is an auto by author for me, for sure. Moving along into the next book that I read for the Transrights Readathon, and that is The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White, who is also an auto by author for me. This is the last book that I had on his roster before his new book comes out in September, which is his adult debut, which I'm really excited for. It's very much like more sci-fi. The rest of his books have been a little more fantasy realm, but The Spirit Bears Its Teeth is about a trans boy who is sent to this institute for girls after he tries to. The world that they live in is a historical world where people started being born with violet eyes, and the people who are born with violet eyes can commune with the spirit world, and they've kind of like risen in society and are kind of like the top echelon of society. And he tries to kind of gain his freedom by stealing a spirit signet to mark him as a medium so that he can kind of do whatever he wants, but he gets caught that he's not the one that's supposed to be receiving this, and things go awry. So he gets sent to this boarding school for girls that is very, very mysterious, and quite sinister things are happening behind the scenes. And he's trying to work with the girls that are there to stop what's going on and also figure out what's happening, because no one really knows what's happening. Girls keep disappearing and no one knows what's happening to them. And just very, very spooky, very much dealing with patriarchy and the ways that women are treated, but also the way that he is treated as someone who isn't a woman, but is seen as a woman by the people around him. And it was just really well done. Andrew Joseph White has such a beautiful way of exploring things that I really, really love. Hell Followed With Us I read for last year's Transrights Readathon, and that was one of my absolute favorite books of the year. And this one is probably also going to be one of my favorite books of the year. I just really, really loved it. I, again, adore the way that Andrew Joseph White explores the themes that he typically has in his work. And I think all 3 of his books are so unique. They feel so independent from one another, which I think is a pretty unique thing for an author to be able to accomplish. They all feel very distinct from one another. I do think Hell Followed With Us is still my favorite, but this one was also very beautifully done. And I almost was a little bit disappointed in the ending, but then we get kind of an epilogue where we are doing what I was afraid we weren't going to do. So I really, really appreciated that that epilogue was in there, and it rocketed my rating back up. Gave this 5 stars, and I will read literally anything that Andrew Joseph White ever writes in his life. All right, next up we have Make Room for Love by Darcy Liao. This one is a sapphic romance following a trans girl, and she has just gotten out of a long-term abusive relationship at the very beginning of this book, and meets a stranger in front of this queer club. Her ex is kind of just like meets her on the street and is harassing her, and this other woman comes to her rescue. She's just been crashing with her friends, and the stranger that she meets is like, hey, I have a spare room in my apartment. I've been looking for someone to rent it because I'm a little short on cash right now. And I'm moving out at the end of the year, but if you want to move in for a few months, go for it. And so she moves in to this room, and they kind of are prickly towards each other, not super friends at the beginning, but the woman is a union electrician and is pretty actively involved in unions and union organization. And the other main character, she is a grad student or a PhD student, and they're trying to unionize their graduate program at the college that they're at because they're being treated pretty poorly by the university. And so she kind of goes to her for help and says, like, hey, can you help me with all this stuff that I'm trying to do for unionizing? And they start spending more and more time together and eventually fall in love. And I thought the romance in this was really, really sweet. I liked the way that they came together, and I liked kind of the foundations of their relationship. And I also, for the most part, really enjoyed the extra things that were going on outside of the romance. We're obviously dealing with all of the union stuff. That's a pretty heavy basis for the plot of this story. But the electrician main character, her oldest sister had died really unexpectedly a couple years ago. And so we're pretty thoroughly exploring grief throughout the entirety of this book. And I really, really loved the way that that was done. It was very emotional and very authentic. And I really liked the ways that that character kind of grew and the levels of grief changed throughout the story. So I really enjoyed that. I will say this book felt a little long to me. I think it could have been cut down. And then there was just like a couple of things that I didn't really love about this book. Specifically, the conflict kind of gets blamed all on one character, which I really didn't enjoy, especially because I personally felt like the entirety of the conflict was not her fault. I do think that she had maybe a more heavy hand in the conflict originating, but she definitely wasn't the only person involved in the conflict. And I hated that she was kind of blamed for the entirety of the conflict, not only from the other romantic interest in this story, but also from some of the surrounding characters and her family. So I didn't really love that. And just like the way that the conflict was handled didn't make me super confident in the relationship that these two characters had. Like the ending, because of the way that the conflict was done, in my opinion, felt very happily for now and not happily ever after. I could very easily see these characters like splitting up in a real life situation in like a year after the end of this book. So yeah, I just didn't really love how that conflict was handled. And I also felt like I didn't see enough character growth from one of our protagonists. And this is also kind of promoted by the author as a bi awakening. And I felt like that was done a little too easily. As someone who didn't know that they were in that same boat, I don't identify as bi, I identify as pan, but like in that same realm of multiple spectrum attraction, I felt like it just like the conclusion that this character was bi, that she came to, was done so easily. I didn't feel like it was like tumultuous enough, if that makes sense. Like I know it can be very, very easy and nonchalant for some people to recognize that about themselves, but I just felt like there wasn't really like any consideration put into it, if that makes any sense at all. So while I did really enjoy a lot of aspects of the story, there also was quite a few things that I didn't love about this story. I think overall I would still recommend it. And I did enjoy most of the aspects of this story. There was just a couple of things that I had personal problems with, so I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. All right, last two. First is Most Ardently by Gabe Novoa, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, and I really, really loved this. This is my third book that I've read as part of this collection. This is the Reimagined Classics collection. I've read Clash of Steel, which is a Treasure Island reimagining, and I've also read Self-Made Boys, which is a Great Gatsby reimagining that I read for last year's Transrights Readathon. And I really enjoyed both of those, and I really enjoyed this one as well. I think that this is a very well done collection. I'm really impressed with all of the authors that have put works into this collection. I think this is a collection that I probably will eventually want to read all of the books in this collection, because I think they all sound pretty interesting. But this is a Pride and Prejudice reimagining, where we're reimagining the story. It is set younger. The characters are like 19-ish, just because this is a young adult collection. collection. They kind of did the same thing with Self-Made Boys. They aged that down quite a bit. But all of the characters are in like 19, 18 age range. But our main character is Oliver Bennett, who is a trans boy, and he is known socially as Elizabeth. And we kind of just explore him. He's not out to pretty much anyone. He's out to his sister Jane and his aunt and uncle, but no one else knows that he is a trans boy. Also to Charlotte, and because she helps cover for him sometimes. But like no one else knows that he's trans, and he will wear his clothes and like sneak out when his family isn't paying attention. And you know, the original encounter with Darcy goes pretty much like the beginning of the original Pride and Prejudice, but then Oliver meets Darcy in a setting where he is presenting as his true self, and they kind of have a different connection, and Darcy treats him very differently than he did when he was presenting as Elizabeth. So their romance, their connection kind of sparks from there. I just really loved the way that this was done. I think all three of the books in this collection, including this one that I've read so far, do really interesting things with like paying homage to the original story while also kind of like critiquing the original story and bringing new themes and characterization to the story. And I've really enjoyed that in all three. And especially in this one, I thought it was really well done. I thought the romance was pretty good in this one, and I really liked all of the extra things that were going on outside of the romance as well, and kind of the themes that we were exploring outside of that. The one thing that I didn't absolutely love was the ending, and the kind of like antagonist of this story felt a little too like mustache twirly evil villain to me, but pretty much everything else besides that was really, really excellent, and I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. All right, very last book of March. This is A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. This one is also a historical romance, and it follows our main character. She is a trans woman, and she is posing as the lady's maid to her sister-in-law. Her sister-in-law and her brother and their son are the only ones that know that she is a trans woman, and she kind of came into her life that she's living right now because she went to war with her best friend, and everyone thought that she died there, but she didn't die. She just came back and has been living her life as her true self. But they get a letter from her best friend's younger sister about how really awful her best friend is doing after the war, and after he thinks that he's lost his best friend. And so her sister-in-law convinces her that they should go up to his estate and try and help him get better. And so we follow from there. And I thought this was really, really well done. In the author's note at the end, Alexis Hall talks about how they really didn't want the conflict of this story to be that the main character was trans, which I think was really well done. And that is definitely not the main conflict of the story. And I really, really appreciated that that wasn't the main conflict of the story. And we explore a lot about grief and the different kinds of love. And I thought all of that was really, really well done. I think these two main characters are really, really well done. And the romance between them, I think, is really beautifully done as well. With that being said, I think a lot of the side characters are pretty meh. A lot of them feel very like cardboard cutout, not real people, in my opinion. And then there's also a crazy plot at the end, which I don't know why we needed such a crazy plot at the end, but I guess so. Yeah, the conflict at the end was like really wild and unbelievable to me. So I thought that detracted from the story a little bit, but like the centerpiece of the story, that is the romance between these two characters, I think was really beautifully done. And the themes that kind of surround those two are really beautifully done, but kind of some of the like further away set pieces were a little iffy to me. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars. And that is everything that I have read in March. This video is quite long while I'm recording. Hopefully I'll be able to edit this down. but we still need to get into my April TBR. So let's go through that pretty quickly. I am doing my TBR a little bit differently this month. I still am putting the 8 books on my TBR is what I've been doing recently. But I usually do 2 physical, 2 digital, 2 audio, and then I have 2 like kind of miscellaneous ones. One of them is for the traveling book club that I'm doing, and then one of them is my like 1 chapter a day book. And I'm still going to keep the 8, but I'm going to play with the format a little bit because of the books that I want to read. So I'm doing 1 physical, 1 audio, the traveling book club, my 1 chapter a day, and then 4 digital. And I'm going to start with the digital just because I think it will be easiest to explain. The reason that I'm doing 4 digital this month is because I got approved for e-arcs of all 4 of the bindery books that are coming out in June. And I really want to read all of those. I'm probably going to do like a little bit of a vlog of reading those 4. But I'm really, really excited about all of those, and I kind of wanted to read them all together. So that's why I'm switching up the formats a little bit. So you may notice I'm in different attire. The end of the video that I recorded, I didn't realize until I was editing the audio completely cut out the entire time I was talking about my TBR basically. So we're re-recording that part. Like I mentioned, I'm doing all 4 of my digital books as the bindery e-arcs. The 4 books are Of Monsters and Mainframes, Black Salt Queen, Crueler Mercies, and the Unmapping. I'm planning to read all 4 of those this month. So let's read the synopsis for all 4 of those first. All right. First up, Of Monsters and Mainframes by Barbara Truelove. Demeter just wants to do her job, shuttling humans between Earth and Alpha Centauri. Unfortunately, her passengers keep dying, and not from equipment failures, as her AI medical system steward would have her believe. These are paranormal murders, and they began when one nasty, ancient vampire decided to board Demeter and kill all her humans. To keep from getting decommissioned, Demeter must join forces with her own team of monsters. A werewolf, an engineer built from the dead, a pharaoh with otherworldly powers, a vampire with a grudge, a fleet full of cheerful spider drones. Together, this motley crew will face down the ultimate evil, Dracula. The queer love child of pulp horror and classic sci-fi, Of Monsters and Mainframes is a dazzling, heartfelt odyssey that probes what it means to be one of society's monsters and explores the many types of friendship that make us human. Next up, we have Black Salt Queen by Samantha Bansil. Hara Duja Gatdula, queen of the island nation of Minara, holds the divine power to move the earth. But her strength is failing, and the line of succession gives her little comfort. Her heir, Leia, is a danger, a petty and passionate princess who wields the enormous power of the skies with fickle indifference. Circling the throne is Amira Kula, the matriarch of a traitorous rival family who wields recklessly enhanced powers of her own, with designs to secure a high-ranking position for her son and claim the crown for her family. Each woman has a secret weakness, a lover, a heartbreak, a lie, but each is willing to pay the steepest price to bring down her rivals once and for all. Filled with passion, romance, betrayal, and divine magic, Black Salt Queen journeys to a gorgeous pre-colonial island nation where women and secrets reign. Then we have Crueler Mercies by Maren Chase. After 9 years as the people's beloved princess in the sun-soaked kingdom of Karka, Vita witnesses the execution of her mother by her father's hand. Forced into exile, Vita fades into obscurity with her only friends, the crows that visit her window. 11 years later, Vita is given a choice: marry an enemy general, granting him legitimacy to take the throne, or die as the forgotten princess. With time running out, Vita meets Celine, an intriguing lady-in-waiting who introduces her to the powerful but unstable magic of alchemy. If Vita and Celine can learn to control it, and the undeniable spark between them, they could burn the world of men to the ground. And lastly, in the bindery books that are coming out in June, we have The Unmapping by Denise S. Robbins. 4 a.m., New York City, a silent disaster. There is no flash of light, no crumbling, no quaking. Each person in New York wakes up on an unfamiliar block after its buildings rearrange their positions overnight. The power grid has snapped, thousands of residents are missing, and the Empire State Building is on Coney Island, for now. The next night, it happens again. Esme Green and Arjun Varma work for the city of New York's emergency management team and are tasked with managing the disaster response for the unmapping. As Esme tries to wade through the bureaucratic nightmare of an endlessly shuffling city, she's distracted by the ongoing search for her missing fiancé. Arjun focuses on the ground-level rescue of disoriented New Yorkers hoping to become the hero the city needs. With scientists scrambling to find a solution, or at least a means to cope, and mysterious red cloak cults cropping up in the disaster's wake, New York begins to reckon with a new reality no one recognizes. For Esme and Arjun, the fight to hold the city together will mean tackling questions about themselves that they are too afraid to ask, and facing answers they never expected. With themes of climate change, political unrest, and social justice, the Unmapping is a timely and captivating debut. So those are the 4 binary books that are releasing in June and the 4 digital books that I'm planning to read this month. For my physical book that I'm planning to read, I am planning to read Oathbound, which is the 3rd book in the Legendborn cycle by Tracy Dion. I'm not going to read the synopsis for that one because I am pretty certain that the synopsis contains spoilers for the 2nd book. But if you haven't read the Legendborn cycle yet, just please do yourself a favor and go check it out. It is very good. I've loved seeing Tracy Dion grow as a writer and an author over the past few years as she's been writing and releasing these. I've really enjoyed seeing her progress, and I love the way that the story is unfolding, and I'm so excited to see what happens in Oathbound and slightly terrified. And then for my audiobook, I have technically already started this, but I've only read one of the stories in it. I am reading The Black Girl Survives This One, which is a young adult horror anthology, and it just has a collection of stories that center Black girls as the main characters and often as the final girls, which is a role that Black girls and Black women do not typically have in conventional horror media. So I have read the first story for that one, and I'm really excited to listen through the rest of the books in that anthology. Then for my miscellaneous category, for my 1 chapter a day, I am still reading the Odyssey, the Emily Wilson version. I didn't really read 1 chapter a day for that in March. The introduction is 100 pages long, and I never just sat down and finished it. I kind of read through it a couple times, but kept stopping in between. And there's not really any good stopping points. So I was kind of just having to judge when to stop. And I didn't really love doing that. So I'm going to try and get through the introduction pretty quickly here in April. And then I will hopefully be able to actually read 1 chapter a day once I have that introduction out of the way. And hopefully we'll get that wrapped up in April. And then for my traveling book club, the book that I am going to get this month is Here for the Wrong Reasons, which is co-written by 2 authors who started co-writing this, and they were just friends or acquaintances, and now they are married, which I think is super cute. But this follows 2 women who are on a Bachelor style show and end up falling in love with each other instead of with the male contestant that they're supposed to be vying for his attention. So I think that's a fun setup. And I have read another queer Bachelor style romance, The Charm Offensive by Alison Cochrun, and I really liked that one. I think it's a fun setup, so I'm excited to read this one for the traveling book club as well. And that is everything on my April TBR, second time recording this section of the video, and also previously all of my March reads. I will see you again very soon for my March reading journal flip through and April setup. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.